Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome along to this webinar. I should say good morning to those in Western Australia. Thank you very much for joining us today for our Future of Finance series. And today's webinar is about redesigning trust for the digital age. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I would like to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land of which each of us is participating in this webinar. Though we may be physically far and wide, each of us is on the land of the traditional owners. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people with us today. Now, today's topic is all about the widening gap in terms of trust, the inequality of trust, and a 23-point gap at the end of 2020. Australians are more and more polarised between, the informed public and mass population than we've ever been, more so than any other nation. And so today's webinar is very much about the pursuit of trust restoration and how do we best tackle this. If I can quote from Rocky Scopellitti's new book, Australia 2030, Where the Bloody Hell Are We? It says that the pursuit of trust restoration in hierarchical models is in the hands of a few. In the hands of a few is a fanciful pursuit. We've crossed the point where we hold greater trust in our own individuality that empowers us through symmetrical access to developments anywhere, anytime, and anyhow. Now, Rocky will very much expand on that today. Delighted to have Rocky join us again at a FinZia webinar. And he'll share his findings about trust from research, which includes 170 CEOs and board directors, some 700 Australian professionals that have shared their political, environmental, regional, demographic, innovation, and technological views about the decade ahead. Joining Rocky, I'm also delighted that we have Jalissa Shrewsbury. Jalissa is a brand culture advisor and personal branding for professional services, author and speaker. And Jalissa will explain how you are at the centre of trust through your connection and credibility with networks and audiences. So very much take that individual perspective. She'll discuss some fresh, practical frameworks for building internal professional confidence with your team and external brand trust with your stakeholders. So the way we're going to run this is Rocky and Jalissa are going to talk for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll move on to a question and answer session. And I'm sure many of you will now be familiar. Down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Q&A button, which is the place to ask those questions. You can pose questions at any time through the webinar. If you're having any technical issues, then use the chat button to talk to the webinar organisers, but please keep questions to the Q&A button, if you could, please. And as always, when we're running these things over the internet, occasionally glitches can occur. So if we do lose connection to any of us, then please be patient, and we'll reconnect as quickly as we can, and she'll be able to get going again quickly, should that unfortunately occur. With no further ado, Rocky, can I introduce you and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris, and welcome everyone. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, taking you through some insights. And those of you who have followed me over the years will know that I've been researching and reporting on trust across many of its different facets. And in my latest research, I guess the idea that I would invite you to commence your thinking with is that trust is a risky thing, right? And as Chris mentioned, that the conditions upon which we trust people, institutions, systems, and technology have profoundly shifted away from this hierarchical-based model where it is bestowed in the hands of a few. Away to more democratized models that distribute attributes of trust technologically, securely, amongst communities and at global scale. And in real time, and so that's kind of the conversation that we'll have. But I call it a renewable energy, and it's fueling our digital world, and it's the emerging technologies that are intertwined into the way we need to think about trust in the way that we live, work, and play this coming decade. Now, there's a wonderful, wonderful thought leader on the topic of trust. Her name is Rachel Botsman. I'd recommend anybody, who's really interested in the evolution of trust to pick up her latest book. And so, her idea is that the topic of trust, institutional trust, and trust taken on faith, kept in the hands of few and operating behind closed doors, was never designed for our digital age. And I think that point really manifests itself, in the area of identity. And it's only now, for example, that we are starting to look at new conventions of identity that fit our digital life. But up till this point in time, we've relied upon, the original conventions of identity, or so we thought, such as user ID and password, for our digital lives. Now, the reality is that user ID and password has nothing to do with your identity. All it proves is that you know two pieces of information. And as we know that, those conventions have systemically failed us. And the reasons why they've failed us is because as our digital lives evolved, on average here in Australia, the average Australian has about 26 online accounts that require a user ID and password. This is, not only banking, but it's news, it's everything else that we do in our digital lives, social media, airlines, what have you. Now, the reality is that if you follow what we are educated to believe about the way we use user ID and password, that means that we have to individually remember 26 different configurations of uppercase, lowercase, alphanumeric, and on it goes. Now, we simply don't behave that way because it's not fit for our digital life. And so identity is an area, just like privacy and security, which is sort of forms the triage around trust. And so Botsman's point is that we've now reached a point in our digital evolution where we profoundly need to, rethink this sort of whole notion of trust. And the traditional model lacks transparency, creates transactional latency, and it's unfit for the 21st century. And up till now, we've treated it independent of risk, which is essentially where I'd like to bring you back to, is to sort of say, trust is a risky thing, and we need to think about that in terms of both impact and likelihood of an event occurred. And so it's misaligned with our technological dependency and outdated for our sort of cultural norms, with now personalization that empowers us through our technology. And so we need to really think about shifting it into a more contemporary model. But just like Botsman points out, we're not saying that that we need to abandon our traditional notions and conventions of trust. It's more that despite their failings in their current form, it's not destroyed, but it needs to adapt to be fit for our digital life. And so, as Chris mentioned in my new book, I make the case that the time for this transition is now. as it's a critical enabler for everything that we want to do socially, economically, politically, and technologically over this coming decade. And the tipping point that I've predicted of when we will flip into this new, more contemporary model of trust is when we'll see corporate audits, compliance, and governance performed by artificial intelligence on distributed ledger technologies and processed by quantum computers. And these are the three major technological shifts and technologies that are really fueling the fourth industrial revolution, which is essentially the decade that we're living in. And so how might those trust enhancing technologies and risk management collectively impact, our industries, our supply chains and organizations? Well, in short, many of those services and indeed some service providers will become automated and replaced by what's referred to as decentralized or autonomous organizations. And these are, networks that are predictive, self-learning, self-provisioning, and self-adapting to the environment and the circumstances around them. But essentially what this means is they run themselves and they're able to operate autonomously due to the clever use of mechanisms that align economic incentives in terms of the way with which risk and reward is distributed, and they become programmatic through the use of software. And so the network's structured to incentivize and operate without the use of traditional trust models, third parties or central authorities or powers. And so a great example here is to think about supply chains. Now, what's continuously going on in supply chains is that you've got the movement of finance between participants in that supply chain. You've got risk management going on within that supply chain. You've got logistics systems, if it's physical items. You've got governance, compliance. You've got so many of these functions going on all the time. And so the point here is that these functions in this sort of decentralized, distributed, autonomous model, they become programmed in software. So for example, when physical goods are transferred between one party to another, the software program releases finance, transfers ownership, and transfers insurance between one party to another, all programmed within the one supply chain. And so one of the things that is important when you think about the properties of trust in this example that I've just provided you is that these things operate in real time. Now, if we sort of then look at this in the context of a great use case that I've used quite a few times, is that if you look at distributed autonomous based audits, audits would no longer become a point in time retrospectively analysed. For example, looking at last year's accounts, audits would occur continuously in real time and on demand. There's significant interests in this kind of use case, not just by organisations, but also by regulators, and because the cost of supervision, as this industry knows all too well, is ballooning to unprecedented levels. And when you think about the pipeline of regulatory reform that needs compliance, monitoring, governance, and the like, it's terrifying, in fact, for any financial institution. And so, if a regulator knows as soon as there is a variation, then, we can potentially do away with a whole cycle of record, audit, and punitive or retrospective fines that often end up in protracted litigation, as we've seen all too well over the past year. To a model where regulators intervene with corrective action as soon as a variation occurs to areas. So, imagine the disruptive impact that would have on the legal profession, the accounting profession, and other professional services areas in regulated markets, not just in financial services, but also healthcare, energy, telecommunications. And so, imagine the transformative impact that could have on the first, second, and third lines of defence when we think about risk management that we have today, disrupted our traditional models of the way that we think about risk. And so, that's probably some pretty big ideas I've put out there. And so the question is, are we really ready for this? The research in my book confirms overwhelmingly so. And so on the question of, do we believe that we will trust technology more than institutions such as governments, banks, retailers, over the coming years? The majority of people absolutely agree with that, and about 30% strongly agree with that. And that was sort of found to be at CEO and board levels, as well as the general professional groups that participated in the study. And so, despite the fact that we hear a lot about the erosion of trust to all-time 20-year lows, particularly here in Australia, as Chris mentioned at the start, with the trust inequality gap, I don't believe that the pursuit of the restoration of trust as it was, 20 years ago, is where we're going to end up. And I think that's not a plausible pursuit. I think how we think about these new models of trust, where we can leverage all of the goodness that's coming out of these emerging technologies, and have trust operating, quite differently to how it's been before in the past. As I mentioned before, one of the key attributes I see about bringing together artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and distributed ledger technology is that you've now got the ability to create new systems of trust that operate in real time. And so on that, I'll sort of pause there and hand back to you, Chris.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Rocky. As you say, some very big ideas there, and I think highlighting how technology has really impacted on trust, how it's changed the nature of trust, both in terms of potentially supporting the development of trust, but also undermining traditional trust systems, and how other stakeholders, not simply like a corporation and its client, but both regulators and individuals are impacted by this. But of course, behind the technology is people, and which I think is a great introduction to us hearing from Jalissa about that people aspect, and talking about not just kind of culture, if you like, at an entity level, and obviously we do tend to focus on the entity and trust between financial service providers, for instance, and their clients, but how it impacts within organisations, how the two of those are connected, and to ourselves personally and our own brand and our own trust, if you like. So look forward to hearing from you, Jalissa.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks, Rocky. Rocky and I had a great chat earlier this week, and it was really interesting to compare notes on the different sides of the coin in which we are looking at trust. So I'm going to share a couple of slides just because I want to show you some examples and some frameworks. So just bear with me a moment. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, let's see. Should be seeing that now. Okay, so can you see that, everyone in the panel? That's okay, great. All right, so I want to show you 3 examples of basically touch points or cues that I've seen online just within the last couple of months. A couple of these examples are from the financial services sector. One of them isn't, and I'll point that out in a moment. But I just want to demonstrate how easily we can understand a company's culture and the values of the leaders and the managers within those organisations, just by what we can find very quickly and easily publicly online. So this example here was just a simple social media post, but it accompanied an opinion article in a major newspaper from somebody who had left her role to pursue something else outside of her former financial advisory role. So you can see some commentary there on what she felt she was being supported in versus what she was not being supported in. This example, although outside of the financial services industry, is quite a strong one. Again, this is a longer post. This one's on LinkedIn, and it's effectively an expose on a national professional membership association in terms of how members' fees are allocated compared to what members think how they're used, and also this person is commenting on the high fee, what people are actually paying and what they should be getting for that, inequalities in hiring staff, and also directly attacking the commitment to the values that this association says that they stand for. I'm just going to give you a moment to process some of that. Okay. And finally, this one, these 4 comments I came across all relating to one financial services company through Glassdoor, where, that's one of many sites where people within organisations or who have left organisations comment on their experience of the culture as well as the leaders and managers that they worked for. So you can see from this example, just within one organisation, that there are a few major culture challenges which really do erode trust for all kinds of stakeholders. And it seems as if they have worsened with the work from home aspect that happened last year for many. So speaking with Rocky and having a look at his book, he points out, the findings of the Edelman Trust Barometer, that it's a regular report, and more recently the changes and the things that are highlighted around trust with the changes that have happened, significant changes that have happened in a very short period of time in our world. This particular report I'm highlighting here is from the Australian Institute of Company Directors on how trust changed in 2020. And they just outline 4 key issues that have been highlighted in media critique about organisations. So putting profits before people, not safeguarding enough jobs, not protecting financial wellbeing of staff and customers, not doing enough to assist stakeholders. So you can see that the feeling that we trust an organisation or a sector is becoming more and more about what are they doing for the broader community and for the world. And I think in my understanding of Rocky's work, this is also highlighted in your findings. And also, fortunately, this week, and some of you might have seen this with Fincia's correspondence, the Starlings 2021 compendium came out. And I did note there, Chris, that you had an article co-authored in there where you were highlighting the requirements for increased professionalism in the financial sector and the banking sector. And you were talking about the 5 E's, so ethics, education, experience, examination, and entity, so belonging to an association like Fincia. So, these are aspects that help an entire sector to be seen as more trustworthy because there are certain standards that are seen to be in place. And my understanding is is that in the financial services and banking space, this is something that is still being developed. I think this was highlighted, Chris, in your work. And I loved the quote in the article, "You do not have professional firms, you have firms of professionals," which I absolutely agree with. All right, so I'm going to show you, some pathways towards solutions, just to sort of finish off my piece. So I'm going to show you 3 frameworks that we at New Work Consulting have developed to help think about how you assess and address trust in terms of brand and culture. So I look at this as, I like to say brand culture, and basically I see it as your brand messages and your brand strategy, so the stuff behind the logo and the website, etc., that is just absolutely intertwined with the culture, with how people within the organization understand, perceive, and believe in the brand and its messages, what you stand for, your purpose, etc., what you're trying to achieve, and then how they communicate that outwardly to stakeholders. So this quadrant here, which I call the brand expression quadrant, is one way that you can start to look for gaps within your team and your organization in terms of how the brand, the intended brand, is expressed or not expressed to stakeholders, both within and externally from the organization. So if we start with the top left quadrant here, we can see that the brand can be expressed in planned ways internally within the organization. So for example, these are just 2 examples that I'm giving you today. If you have an internal newsletter, that might be a formal communication internally with your team members, with your wider organization. And that would be telling us something about the brand, the culture, what you stand for in fairly planned ways. I've put online team meetings with a question mark because if they are really planned well in terms of what you are communicating you value in those team meetings, then that could be seen as a planned expression of the brand internally within the organization. If you then look at unplanned ways that the brand is expressed, so things that we may not realize we're doing internally within the organization, it could be examples such as what is communicated on your intranet and through staff email exchanges. And then, of course, a brand is intended to be expressed externally in order to build trust with key stakeholders and the wider community as well. So in terms of the planned ways, that's very easy. That's the things that we always sort of think about as the things that are the intended brand messages. So the company website, official social media. Staff LinkedIn profiles I've question marked because it depends how much work the organisation has done to support their team members with building their personal brands through their LinkedIn and reflecting the organisation back there. Again, outbound emails could be planned in terms of the way we communicate who we are as professionals when we email clients, for example, or it could be an unplanned thing if you haven't paid attention to that. And similarly, virtual client meetings, what are the underlying messages and feelings that the client is getting from a virtual meeting, in person as well, but we're focused here today is in the online space, around what this brand stands for and what you as a professional stand for if you're the one communicating with them. And finally, there are unplanned ways that we understand a brand and in terms of the broader community and your stakeholders. So, for example, you can't control the media, what they comment on and the stories they pick up. The personal social media of staff, it's their personal accounts, so you can't and shouldn't be trying to control everything that they're doing there. And even the most well-meaning employee may be creating messages and cues through their personal social media and not realizing or not thinking about how not private your private social media really is. There's very little privacy these days, as most people are aware, but we're not always thinking about that. Again, the staff reviews, like I highlighted in the example, customer reviews, and staff engagement in online networking and webinar opportunities. And this is something I've noticed more and more, obviously, in the last year where we've been so much more online with our communications and our learning, that I have been able to tell things very quickly about organisations from innocent comments that people make in chat. So let that be a warning to everybody. It's something to think about. Do contribute to chat, but think about, what might be the underlying message. I have seen somebody comment on something that hinted about the financial distress that a company was in, that they were a team member of. I've seen comments that suggest to me that that employees don't feel supported by their leadership, just by something they've said in answer to a question in chat during a webinar or an online session. So these are things that we are not necessarily educated about, and it's something that's worth having a conversation with your team members about, because everybody outside of that organisation is getting hints about, what happens within your organisation and whether it's an organisation that they can trust. So hopefully that's a helpful framework in terms of sitting with your team and thinking about, where are our brand messages coming out? What are the things we've addressed, and what are the things that we need to address going forward? Now I'm going to turn to you personally as a professional, because I do believe that, people at this stage at least still primarily do business with people. And although you cannot ignore how technology is changing our lives on a daily basis, it is a tool and a complement and becoming more and more our environment. However, we're still talking about, basic human brains. We haven't evolved that much in terms of how we connect with people, that we need to have one-on-one conversations, look people in the eye, and we make decisions very quickly and subconsciously about whether we can trust someone. And that trust of one person can then extend to how we feel about an entire organization or even a sector. And everyone's heard comments about particular sectors based on an experience that somebody has had. If somebody says a lawyer is a shark, it's probably that they've had a really bad experience. However, not all lawyers are sharks. So it's something to keep in mind. So I want you to think about, in terms of you as a professional, or you could, if you're a leader, you might like to also think about certain team members. Where do they sit on the trust map? So in terms of their skill level and their commitment to building trust with stakeholders, they could be at different ends of the scale. So with skill level, they might be not very good at creating trust, or at the other end of the scale, they could be very, very good at it. In terms of commitment to building trust with stakeholders, they could be completely unaware or not care, or at the other end, it could be a top priority in how they do business and how they progress through their career. So if you think about yourself or somebody else within your organisation, perhaps, in terms of where they sit on this map, first of all, if they were in the bottom left-hand corner, if they were not very good in skill level at creating trust, and they were completely unaware that it matters, or they don't care about it, we could say that they are invisible or impression breakers. So they might be unaware about how they are perceived. They might be unaware of the importance of building trust online, because that's the first place that we meet people and get to know people in organisations. They may say that they don't like social media, particularly if it's for work, or they might say things like LinkedIn or networking is a waste of time. So then on the right-hand side of that, if the skill level is not very good with building trust, but people see it as a top priority, this might be people such as, your inexperienced financial advisors, your younger staff in some cases. So these would be what I call keen impression makers. They're probably on social media constantly, but not necessarily very mindful or aware of how that builds or breaks down their personal brand, and by extension, the image of the organisation and the sector. They may make mistakes in their communication. They may come across as too salesy, which, that's a whole other topic that I'd love to go into, but I feel like that is a very outdated approach, particularly in professional services. And they may, at best be quite unfocused with their actions in building trust and outreach. On the other side, if we've got people who are very, very good on the left-hand side at the top at creating trust, but they don't necessarily kind of do it purposefully, like they're not aware that they're doing it, they're just sort of natural at it, we could call these people under the radar. And this is where most professional people sit, particularly as they're moving up in their career. They might be very technical people, very intellectual people, or really, really good at what they do. They may be introverts. We may label them as quiet achievers. They prefer just to sort of hide away in their office and do their work. And they say things like, I just do my job, I just get on with it. I don't really think about what I contribute or promoting myself. Now, that's a really nice idea. But the problem with these people, if they are trying to bring business in or build a reputation or get to know new people and expand their network, is that they're flying under the radar. People don't necessarily notice them. So finally, what we're all trying to get towards is the top quadrant here, the trusted advisor. And we've heard this term a million times, but a true trusted advisor is somebody who is brand aligned with the brand values of the organization. They are truly a go-to advisor, not just in the way they're seen, but in practice, in how they conduct themselves and their business and their relationships. They are always top of mind. They are more frequently referred. They're more visible online. They might be developing some sort of thought leadership, and they are networked, they're proactive, and they're leveraged in the actions that they take. And this all contributes to having a very strong level of professional confidence, and professional confidence in the individual builds trust in the brand more broadly. So it's a really good stepping stone for that. So finally, and very quickly, I'm just going to show you one sort of step forward in terms of building that professional confidence. And this is just a very sort of high level overarching model that we use in building personal brand development of team members and individuals. So it's starting with definition, clarity, and really defining in order to demonstrate your particular skills, your personality traits that serve you, and most importantly, the value that you bring to stakeholders and how it aligns with your organization. So defining those messages first is the core of any good brand, whether it's a business or a personal brand. Once you've got that definition, that positioning really clear, it's about elevating how people see you by communicating those messages more visibly. So making a plan around that. So then ideally you're using that to connect with people and opportunities, and connecting in a way that is human and real, because people are craving that more than ever. It's really, really important that it is authentic and that we're thinking about the other person rather than it just being what's our, elevator pitch, what are we trying to get across? Because people are really switching off with those sorts of conversations if you're leading with that all the time. So while you are very clear about what you want to communicate, you also need to think about how you're connecting with people in a genuine way. And this has become much more challenging online, but at the same time, the technology that we have at our fingertips now helps us to reach people, not only more broadly, but potentially more deeply in some really focused conversations. And finally, hopefully that leads you to attracting more of the things that you want in your career and in your business. So for example, fine-tuning the market that you serve, getting the best role possible within your career or the next step, upwards, more clients, more sales, etc. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank everyone for your time. I'm just going to leave those slides. Thanks.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Jalissa. And as you've highlighted, culture and trust are absolutely inextricably linked. And the impact. Talked a lot about the impact of social media and how that's changing trust. In fact, as we were talking, it occurred to me we used to talk about culture as being what happens when no one's looking. I think you've kind of turned that on its head, and you're saying to an extent, that culture is what's happening when everyone's looking.
It is the case now.
It is the case now, and that's a very dramatic shift, isn't it? So I wanted to kick off with a question, perhaps yourself first, Jalissa, and then to Rocky, in terms of, how do we get our staff, how do we get our people to care about their personal brands and being ambassadors for the organisation in order to build trust with stakeholders? So maybe have the challenge for all leaders now.
Yes, thanks, Chris. That's a question I get all the time, because obviously if you're going to be embarking on, developing this within your organization, you need to get people's buy-in, you need to get everybody on board and make it part of the culture as well. I talk about a culture of confident personal brands being, shaping and giving people the opportunity to shape how they see themselves and what they're communicating more clearly about themselves in alignment with the organization's goals. So in terms of getting people to care about it, it really is an awareness piece. So, giving them an opportunity to look at some of these gaps and where they might be presenting something about who they are as an individual professional, and is that really aligned with what it is they want to communicate and what they need to communicate in order to achieve their goals in their career. So if you make it about them, that's where you're getting the buy-in.
Okay, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I heard this wonderful quote, Chris, and I apologise, I can't remember who it was from, but the quote is that trust more than money makes the world go round. And I think, we sort of hear a lot about, customer experience, employee experience. Without trust, you do not have an experience. And so it's kind of like, repositioning trust at the center of everything that we do, whether that is, customer facing, whether that is, back office, middle, wherever. Trust is required in every aspect of a relationship between yourself professionally with your colleagues and the organisation. It's central to achieving the desired strategic objectives of the organisation if it comes to customer experience or whatever the activity may be. And so ask the question, if there's a proposal or a product idea that you might be working on or whatever, ask the question, how is this going to improve the relationship, the trust relationship with the customer? So I think it's kind of like it should come out of being sort of something that has taken a battering to sort of saying, how can we enhance it? How can we use technology to remove the opportunity where something could fail that could result in eroding the trust with the customer? Automation plays an incredible role in that, as well as removing friction and all of the other good things.
Rocky, talking about technology, just to let you know that fortunately we can hear your voice, but your video has frozen. May want to look at that. But I'll sort of follow up that question with, therefore, how do you assess trustworthiness? We're familiar with measures such as Glassdoor, for instance, for employer trust and feedback there, and our own regulators are having recognised this link between culture and trust. Are seeking to assess culture. Could you talk a little bit about the measurement, perhaps, Jalissa, and how do we measure this?
That's a tricky question, isn't it? Well, simply, one thing that I like to look at when I walk into an organisation is how connected are people at all levels of the organisation to the values that the brand espouses. So when I'm talking about brand, I'm talking about, the core messages that the organisation is communicating. So, I might ask an employee, can you tell me about the brand? What does the brand stand for? What does this business stand for? And at best, I tend to get a rattled off, a memorized list of 5 or 6 values that are on the website. At worst, I just sort of get a shoulder shrug and a guilty look. And it happens more often than you would think, not specifically with one particular size organisation either. It doesn't seem to matter whether it's a really established large corporate or it's a very small business. In fact, sometimes the smaller businesses have a little bit more of a strong culture around, you know, that connection to the brand, because it's fewer people, it's easier to have that communication. So, you know, that's, you know, asking people to talk about, you know, what are the values and are they aware of it within their own organization is one thing. But my follow-up question is always, what does that mean to you? So if they do manage to tell me even one or two of the values that the brand talks about, that the brand stands for, then I ask them, you know, what does this mean for your daily work? How do you see this playing out in your work? How do you contribute to that? And how well they understand that really tells you about not only how well, you know, that culture is built around those values, but by extension, how much we can trust those values, that marketing that we see, those communications that we see. In terms of measuring trust, I think it is about values. If somebody talks the talk, but they don't walk the walk, we see that very quickly. And it's very obvious in even the tiniest details to us, like a facial expression or a comment on a post on social media. We can very quickly see through to people's real internal motivations. And we do that, as I said earlier, subconsciously. So it's looking at how aligned are we to our values and how meaningful are they in terms of our daily work.
Great, thank you. And good to have you back, Rocky. I think you probably caught the question, which was very much about how do we assess trust and culture and trustworthiness. You know, as Jalissa's highlighted, really the connection there between the values of the organisation and so on. But you may have a perspective around, you know, the technology sense and how technology perhaps might help in that assessment.
Yeah, so in the research, Chris, I asked the question, you know, would you trust an automated, robot to make decisions on your behalf? And 1 in 3 people said yes. And so coming back to the point, I think it's kind of like stepping away from thinking about trust as only being something that we do with people, to think about the role of technology in that. We're increasingly becoming more and more reliant and trustworthy of our technology to be able to guide us from a location perspective from point A to point B. You know, Siri's quite busy these days, Chris, being asked all sorts of questions. So the role of personal assistance in our digital lives is something that has now sort of taken place and will only increase through the course of time. And so where I think it's going to get really, really exciting is when these technologies become predictive. And so if you think about, you know, just payments, if we think about the use of digital wallets now, mobile phones, to pay for goods and services, you know, COVID has ratcheted up everybody's awareness on, you know, using those kinds of applications for, you know, for our own safety. But how cool is it going to be when those wallets start becoming predictive? So when I'm at the point of service, for example, how cool would it be that that wallet is saying, you know, don't use this Visa card, use this Visa card, or use this, you know, loyalty program. You know, it's kind of giving me a level of personalization that is real-time, contextualized in the environment that it could be at, whether I'm at the supermarket or wherever I may be. That's when I think, you know, we're really going to see trust, you know, trust in our technology take on a completely new and different meaning.
Right. A reminder to everyone, there is the Q&A button. We're getting some great questions come in, so I'm going to move to ask a couple of those if I can. And firstly, from Wade Keyser, that's the question. In terms of building trust back in financial services, is the onus on the companies, the industry, the individuals, or is it everybody? And where should the focus go in terms of rebuilding this trust?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, Chris, it's everyone. You know, and it comes back to, you know, I think thinking about trust by design, always asking the question, how is this feature in this app going to improve our trust relationship with our customer? Or, you know, so I think everybody's got a role to play here. It's not up to our leaders. It's not up to organisations. It's up to everyone. The point that we've reached, you know, according to the Edelman study, shows that the erosion of trust has hit a worldwide 20-year low, and this isn't just trust as defined in a relationship between you know, an organisation and a customer. This is the erosion of trust in our leaders, in our systems, right across the political and the commercial divide as well, religious institutions, the whole lot. And so we've now got this all-time low where we can now sort of say, okay, what do we want trust to be? And you know, what opportunities do we now have to design it in such a way that it's fit for purpose?
And Jalissa, could I ask you the same question, but perhaps also add, you know, we have the context that we talk now about people having multiple careers, and we've moved to an environment where people may change employer and indeed, you know, career, you know, every couple of years. So kind of very hard to develop that trust, perhaps. So how do we handle that situation as well? We've got this constant turnover.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And before I address that piece, I just want to comment on what Rocky was saying. I agree that individuals have a role to play in trust, and certainly the collective is demanding increased trustability or trustworthiness in the business sector, in the business world, in organizations that they work with, that they do business with. So I do think it's about the individuals. I also believe that board and leadership have a very important role to play in rebuilding or building trust. It's only been in the last few years that boards in terms of commercial boards have, in a general sense, across the board, they have started to really take culture seriously in their agenda. But you see very, very few boards take any kind of leadership on brand and the connection between the brand messages and the culture within the organisation. And it's very hard to get alignment if you haven't got that coming from the very top. So I do think there's an important opportunity there for business leaders. Going to the individual and your question around people changing their careers, and this is just the reality of the world we live in now. I mean, I've had 3 careers. I'm almost 41, and so in my 20 odd, or a few more years if you count all McDonald's jobs and things like that, but in my 20 odd sort of years of being in career roles, I've had 3 careers. So I have worked in education as a primary school teacher. I did that for 10 years. And then I have run 2 businesses that are very, very different in the last 10 years. And what I found in my experience was that in order to do well in whatever the next role was, I needed to not only find a new network, expand my networks and my audiences to fit that, but I also had to find a way to not only earn my credibility in terms of experience, but to communicate that and to earn it in terms of how other people saw me. So for example, the first business I had was a corporate photography business, and I had a small team. But when I transitioned and started doing a lot more work in terms of brand, culture, and personal branding, I needed to be seen as an expert in that space that I believed I was becoming, because it was a very niche environment I'd been studying and working on in the background for years. But for people to be able to see me as an expert in that space, I really needed to shape how people trusted that brand. And that was about clarity and showing a track record and showing testimonials and, sticking to those values that I described earlier, of saying, look, this is what I stand for. This is what I believe in. This is what I'm trying to do. And making sure that all my communications, particularly online, were consistent with that. So over time, that builds trust, and also just recognition from people that that's the space you play in. You're a go-to in that space. So I hope that answers the question in terms of career transition.
Right. Look, I'm going to be really fair. There's a couple of questions I'd like to squeeze in. We always like to finish on time, so we can ask for a couple of quick answers here, but I think would be fascinating to get is firstly a question from Steve Svetko. It seems power is shifting to a monopolized social media and the corporations and CEOs who control much of the AI. How do you trust that model? That's not going to take us to 1984. Again, perhaps Jalissa, if you'd like to kick off on that, and we'll hand over to Rocky. But I say we'll try and squeeze it in. I'll squeeze one more question if we can.
That's a good question. I think that it's around education, you know, for yourself and for the people around you within your organization, for example, in order to be discerning and really understand where our information is coming from. It's about education. There was a study a few years ago around Facebook, which really cracked it open. And it was the first time people realized just how little of what we're seeing is genuine. It's not that it's not necessarily real information, but it is curated for our viewing as an individual. So what is that doing to how we see the world?
Rocky.
Yeah, well, you can look forward, Steve, to seeing what we refer to as guardian bots or guardian angels, and this is where we'll use technology to guard us, you know, against life's unforeseen hazards, and you know, and about 3/4 of people in a global study believe that you know, privacy guardians will organise our personal devices to reduce our digital footprints and block electronic snooping. So we'll see a whole range of new technologies that will shift the pendulum back in favour of ourselves in relation to our digital lives.
Right, I think we're all hanging out for those guardian angels. One final question, really unfair one, but I can't resist. Very topical. Vaccination, trust, AstraZeneca, and so on. You know, what would you do if you were in the position of you know, our health leaders? I know that's definitely a big question to throw on you at such short notice, but maybe you've got just a quick thought on that, and one from Jalissa.
I think the public want to be as informed as possible. So transparency and communication and choice is important.
So listen carefully to our experts. It is those who we've relied on throughout this whole pandemic, not the politicians, the experts. Listen to them carefully and follow their advice.
Okay, so very much taking it back to professionalism, and the trust that can be placed in professions, because, you know, people have the right motivation and even like structures around them to allow us to trust that advice. A great place for us to finish. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for your time today and a fascinating conversation. And look, thanks to all our FINSIA members and guests for their attendance. And I hope that you have all found it very useful. We'll send you a link to feedback form in the chat box now. We really would appreciate your feedback. Help us continue to develop our webinar program. Next week, we have our final webinars in the Future of Finance series, which are focused on careers. And we have just discussed how many of those we might have. So we're delighted to have Rocky join us again next week in terms of future-proofing your career. And in our final webinar, we do a deep dive into data literacy and why it's more important than ever to be data savvy. So go to the events page on the FINSIA website to register for those webinars, and look out for the CPD newsletter. And meanwhile, enjoy the rest of your Friday and a great weekend. And again, enormous thanks to Jalissa and Rocky for your time today. Thank you very much.